How much of drug use is genetic and how much of it is based on how you grew up? Today, I will tell you what twins teach us about drug use and which types of addictions are more closely linked to genes than others. So one of the most important things that I try to teach people in my drug education class is that there is no drug destiny. If your parents use, that does not guarantee that you're going to use. If you've tried something once, that does not guarantee that you're going to become addicted, because addiction is this incredibly complex topic. And genetics is just one aspect of that. So I picture this if Douglas Adams made some sort of flow chart. That's how I'd picture addiction. All of these different things are feeding into one another, and there's all these different if-then statements. Did your parents use? Did you have access to drugs? Are you in a society that specifically is more accepting of different types of drugs? Do you have a psychological disorder? Did you have trauma occur when you were a child? All of these things then lead to increased vulnerability for addiction. So how then do we figure out what role genetics actually plays? How do we take apart genetics from everything else, the environmental influences? Well, there are a couple of different ways that we try to do this. You can look at this more population-based level. You could look at different genetic variants that are linked to different drug use. So for example, in the Southeast Asian population, they are more likely to have a genetic variant that makes you flush and turn bright pink when you drink. And so that genetic variant is linked to a decrease in alcohol use. Or we could do things look more at the individual level. So for example, we could look at people who have identical DNA, so identical twins. Now, side note, they kind of have identical DNA, but we've actually been able to tell them apart in forensic situations. When crimes have taken place, we found that people do have differences. Even identical twins have epigenetic differences that lead to different DNA outcomes. So you've been able to tell identical twins apart, which is anti all of the crime dramas that are about. But anyways, identical twins have almost identical DNA. And so you can look to see, do the twins use the same drug? So if it is purely genetics that is causing drug use, what you should see is that if you have identical DNA to another person, that other person is just as likely to use drugs as you are. So the concordance rate here is how likely is that other twin to have that same thing? So if, for example, one twin has autism spectrum disorder, we see the concordance rate for that is around 66 to 96%. It is fairly high. So 66 to 96% of the time, if one twin has autism spectrum disorder diagnosis, the other twin would also then be diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. So even for something like autism, which has a very strong genetic basis, there is not this 100% guarantee. And the numbers for drug use and dependence are actually much lower than for things like autism. So Harvard actually did a huge study on this, specifically looking at what are the different concordance rates for things like drug use. And specifically they were looking at use disorder. So the actual addiction side of things, not just having tried it once. And what they found was that some were lower than others. So for psychedelics, the concordance rate was about 0.25, meaning that if there was one identical twin who had a psychedelic use disorder, which is very rare, and I'll get to that in a second, if they had one twin that had that, then 1 out of 4 of those identical twins were likely to have psychedelic use disorder. The problem with some of the low estimates, though, so for things like stimulant use, specifically meth use, is that there were very few identical twins who both used, or one used and the other didn't. So they just didn't have the number to see how genetically driven this was, likely because a lot of people are not going to self-report that they're using things like meth or psychedelics because they're illegal. Now, you also saw concordance rates with alcohol being around 26%, so that was relatively low too. And then cannabis was higher, and then the highest in terms of concordance rates in this study was specifically opioid use, as well as cocaine use too. And what you see here is that those are around 0.44, 0.43. So still not that high, nowhere near that 60s to 90s that you're getting with autism spectrum disorder. Now, that was looking specifically at dependence. So when you look at overall use, cannabis actually jumps up there to 0.71. So maybe here the actual just initial use of drugs, that is more strongly genetically based, but whether you become addicted, that might be less dependent on your genetics. Now, there's one interesting caveat to that, and that appears to be alcohol. And that's not looking at concordance rates. Here I'm talking about what is known as heritability. So it is not are two identical twins the same? How often are they different? Heritability actually measures something different. So in this case, heritability is measuring the proportion of variation in the population. So this idea of drug use, how much of the variation between people using drugs. So some people use a lot of drugs, some people don't use that many drugs, some people use a moderate amount but don't become addicted. How much of that is driven by genetics? Alcohol is interesting here because that initial use, that is actually less likely to be heritable than the actual alcohol use disorder. And we see that alcohol use disorder might be more strongly genetically linked in sons versus daughters. So there's something weird, like maybe something Y-linked going on with alcohol use disorder. We're not entirely sure yet. The genetics of alcohol are kind of different from everything else. Now, this research has also taught us that there might be more overlap between certain drugs, so like whether or not you use a certain drug, and like a common underlying vulnerability to addiction. So there's this idea that like maybe you're not just vulnerable to like alcohol use disorder, but vulnerable to addiction in general. And so the drug that you're choosing to use is alcohol. And we do see that certain drugs, there is more of a contribution of kind of this like overall vulnerability to them. So for example, opioids, actually there's less of a contribution of the overall vulnerability. Like when people get addicted to opioids, it seems like that's more specific to opioids than the more general, I'm getting addicted to things like cannabis, which are more driven by this common vulnerability, just drugs overall. So maybe addiction to opioids might be more closely linked to like genetics involving pain versus something like genetics involving addiction in general. Now, heritability for most drugs ranges between like 0.4 to 0.8. Some go a little bit lower on that range, some go a little bit higher on that range, but overall it's about 0.5 to 0.6, suggesting that like half of the variation of drug use that we see around the world is driven specifically by genetic differences. So things that your genes are doing that might make you more sensitive to reward, or make you more sensitive to a specific drug, or more sensitive to having problems quitting something, or more sensitive to stress, which makes you more likely to self-medicate. Like there are so many different ways that genes can play a role in addiction. The important thing to remember here is that none of those studies showed 100%. There was no number that said that if you have this gene, you are guaranteed to become addicted. You be more vulnerable? Yes. Should you think about that when you're considering using a drug? Yes. But is anything destiny? No.